out here. Shout to Black Feminist Future, Paris Hatcher and her team, Kia, everybody. Thank you so much for this beautiful gathering. So I'm just gonna actually set this off and go in order. But first I just wanna say that Black feminisms get us free, which we know is one of the themes. And I feel that at their best, Black feminisms expand our understanding and our adoration of Black people. They teach us to build power and embrace our fullness. In our world, Beyonce, Rihanna, Meg Thee Stallion, and SZA belong in the same conversation as Bell Hooks, Octavia Butler, Audre Lorde, Ida B. Wells, and Assata Shakur. And so through this lens, because this is the pulse in how we're shaping politics, society, and culture, I'm going to talk to three just amazing women, powerhouses, who also are changing the culture. First, I have Wawa, Gatheru, right? Got it? Okay. Wawa Gatheru, she'll pronounce it better if I messed it up, is a Gen Z climate activist, a Rhodes Scholar, and the founder and executive director of Black Girl Environmentalists, the only national organization dedicated to addressing the pipeline and pathway issue for Black girls, women, and gender-expansive people in the climate sector. Wawa has been recognized as a Glamour College Woman of the Year, a L'Oreal Woman of Worth, and has been named to several notable lists, including Forbes 30 Under 30, Ebony Power 100, Grizz 50, and Afrotech Future 50. She was also featured on the January 2023 digital cover of Vogue alongside Billie Eilish and 7 other climate activists. So let's welcome her. Next, we have Alicia Garza. Alicia is an author, political strategist, and organizer. She founded the Black Futures Lab in 2018 to make Black communities powerful in politics. In 2023, the organization conducted the Black Census Project, the largest survey of Black communities in the U.S. history. Yes, let's give it up for that. As if that's not enough, Alicia is also the co-creator of Black Lives Matter, which now has 50 chapters in 4 countries. Alicia has become a powerful voice in the media, contributing expert commentary on politics, race, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Her work has been featured in Time, MSNBC, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and The Guardian. Alicia's first book, The Purpose of Power, How We Come Together When We Fall Apart, was released in October 2020, and she also shares her thoughts on politics and pop culture on her podcast, Lady Don't Take No. So give it up for Alicia Garza. And finally, we have Beulah Osueke. Beulah is a coach, a strategist, and an organizer. She's currently the executive director of New Voices for Reproductive Justice, an organization dedicated to building power for and alongside Black women, Black queer folks, and Black marginalized communities in Pennsylvania and Ohio. In addition to working with New Voices, Beulah is a leadership member of Reframe and the Radical Communicators Network, 2 narrative-focused organizations resourcing social justice communicators across the nation. She's also the founding director of PILR Training, a Philadelphia-based network of coaches driving social change through sports. So let's give it up for Beulah. So, quick announcement before we jump in. Hey, Justin. A quick announcement before we jump in. You have question cards on your table. As questions come to you, please fill them out and raise your hand, and a volunteer will pick them up. And we will try to answer as many as possible after we have our discussion. So I am actually going to kick things off with Black Futures Lab because as a journalist, I'm so obsessed with political attitudes and how folks say we care about things that we probably don't actually care about. So Black Futures Lab conducted the largest survey of Black political attitudes since Reconstruction. You reached about 200,000 of us through word-of-mouth campaigns, social media, text message banks, partnerships with Black influencers, and participation in community events. So why did you use this kind of comprehensive strategy rather than just doing a traditional political poll? And how does it serve your mission of identifying real priorities, as you say on your site, shaping an agenda created for us by us? Hey.
How y'all doing?
Yeah, y'all good?
So, for the Black Census, the reason that we decided to do it that way and not do polling is because polling, I think, often is used as like a tool against our people. And by that, what I mean is, how many of y'all seen like the news and they'll be like, 85% of Black people think this. And then you're like, wait, what? Where? And then and then you go into like all the like details of, well, what poll? Okay, it's 100 people, right? 100 people all over the age of 55, and then they don't tell you like where and all the things, and you don't know when the poll happened, but now all of a sudden 85% of Black people think, feel, or want a thing, right? So instead of doing that, what we wanted to do was create a project that allowed us to speak for ourselves. And we did a lot of work intentionally to make sure that we were talking to the various complexities of who we are. So we did these surveys inside of prisons and jails in partnership with organizations who are working with people who are currently and formerly incarcerated. We worked with base building organizations across the country to take this out into the communities where they're already building power. We partnered with influencers. We actually also tried to find Black folks through like market research, right? We just wanted to figure out where could we find us in all of our different identities and all of our different locations, and then pull all of that together into something that's comprehensive, that wasn't ever intended to say 85% of Black people think, feel, or want this, because it's just like not a thing, right? We want to be specific about which Black folks, at what point in time, for what reason. But the other thing that we really wanted to do was influence and impact policy. And policy is like a big fancy word for the rules that govern our lives, and too often policies are made about us without us. And so we wanted to create a project where we were grounding people's vision, needs, longings, dreams, and translating that into the rules that can and should govern our lives, and contesting for the story of what policy should look like and who should design policy, right? So that's why we didn't do traditional polls, because our goal here is not to build the power of political parties as they stand. Our goal is to build the power of our communities, and in doing so, we will shape the agenda of political parties. We will shape the agenda of presidential administrations, and we will shape the agenda of state houses and courthouses across our country if we ourselves are organized independently. So that's why we do it that way.
Amazing, thank you. So, I feel like this is related in that Big Voices has four pillars: community organizing, policy and advocacy, voter engagement, and narrative power. And so our question is, what role does storytelling play in your work? And how do you speak to people who don't have direct experience in movement or academic spaces where people a lot of times assume feminism only works?
Well, first of all, there's my favorite kind of people. Because they're the people that we need with us and informing us and grounding us and humbling us. So I actually enjoy talking with people that are not familiar with the expectations, the performance, all of that. So I just wanted to offer that. Also wanted to offer appreciation to Paris for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I remember when I was at Gatheru in 2023 and I was sitting in the audience and I was in awe listening to people speak. I was just so inspired. I felt like I was floating. And so for Paris to invite me, it was kind of surreal. And I just want to be true to myself and name that for myself. So as you shared in the bio, I came to movement through communications. I actually thought that communications was simply press releases, emails, getting people to give a crap about what my organization was talking about. Then I participated in a fellowship that was held by Reframe, and I was introduced to my mentor, Chanel Matthews, who every time I have the mic, I'm gonna call her Chanel Matthews, because Chanel changed how I viewed my role in the movement. And I'm sure many of us have heard the quote from Tony K. Bombard, the role of the cultural organizers to make movement irresistible. And because I wasn't yet deep into the movement, most of my people, most of my community, they were people that didn't know anything about this. They didn't have the ization, epistema, all these big words. They were not saying it, right? They were like, and I was like, no. But I was learning theory and I was learning all these things that helped me elevate my understanding, right? And I was able to shift blame from myself, or thinking someone needs to pull up their pants, or thinking somebody was too lazy, to recognize these systems that were converging and coordinating with each other in order for myself and my people to feel like crap, right? So I want to name that because I think sometimes we assume that people just miraculously arrive at their analysis, their articulation, and that is not fair to the journey, right? So I just want to offer that. I'm also very serious about narrative strategy, so I wrote some things down, because I know y'all got some pen and paper, and I want to be clear about what narrative strategy is and what narrative power is. So narrative strategy is the practice of sharing connected stories to forge, spread, and reinforce beneficial narratives and counter harmful ones. Right? So that's what narrative strategy is. Sure will, and I'll say it slow. Narrative strategy is the practice of sharing connected stories. Narrative strategy is the practice of sharing connected stories to forge, spread, and reinforce beneficial narratives and counter harmful ones. So that's narrative strategy, right? So if what's happening to Black people in Mississippi is happening to Black people in Pennsylvania, it's happening to Black people in Arizona, right? Then it's not our individual moral, social failures, right, that they would have us to believe. These are oppressive myths and ideology that have us consume empires' lives, right, so that we don't believe that something greater is on the horizon, right? So that's how I understand narrative strategy. Narrative power is the ability to tell stories that shift the mental models and cultural mindsets that define our cultural norms, right? So narrative strategies here, narrative power is the ability to have conversations with people, individual, collectives, that shift the mental models, right? And also the cultural mindsets that redefine our cultural norms. So what does that look like at New Voices for Reproductive Justice? We engage our community members, we talk to them, we ask them what their fears are, their anxieties, their hopes, their aspirations. We actually have our canvassing teams that calls people, hundreds of people every single day, right? We gather this insight, we write it down, right? Then from this information, we synthesize it through an RJ lens. So let me give a concrete example. In 2023, we spoke with over 500 Black people spread across Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. And we asked a myriad of questions, but one of them being, what is your top concern, right? And we did so that we could understand what was the unique profile of each of our 3 individual cities, right? Thinking that it would help us be better organizers, we can customize our programming and all of that. Across all 3 cities, and I'm not lying because my team is right there. They're gonna say you're lying if I'm lying, okay? Across all 3 cities, the #1 concern was gun violence. Across all 3 cities, right? So, an RJ lens doesn't say more police. An RJ lens says, how can we reimagine public safety, right? We know that the safest communities are the ones that are the most resourced, right? So then that informs how we engage elected officials in their offices. Instead of having the answer be more police, more surveillance, it's how can we better serve our communities because they don't feel safe on the streets. So that's what we do across the board with all of the different policy priorities that we have. And we're very intentional with infusing RJ ideology to everyday practices, everyday conversations, and not dumbing down our language, but making sure that we're speaking in a way that excites people and has them say, damn, that's it. Can I have more, can I learn more about this? So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Wawa, Black girl environmentalist, and I went on your website and was struck by the visual representation of Black women, girls, and gender-expensive people in environmental work. And so I'm just curious about why visual representation is important to the work that you're doing in terms of keeping a pathway or creating a pathway and retaining Black folks in the climate justice movement.
Yeah, of course. Well, first, hi everyone. Oh, that was so cute. I am so excited to be here, to be embraced by the BFF community, and to be here with you both. I'm genuinely in awe and kind of fangirling. But to answer your question as to why representation, visual representation is important, there's so many different ways I can answer that. But first and foremost, the visuals that we have been given around the climate movement and what the climate crisis is has not included us, even though we are folks that are at the forefront of environmental injustices and are at the forefront of experiencing the brunt of the climate crisis. So it's important from a historical perspective to showcase the existing movements that exist. The EJ movement is led and run by Black women and Indigenous folks. Many of those women are from this state, are in Cancer Alley, and who have been doing this work for generations. So many of my mentors and folks who advise me in my work are specifically Black women, generational African Americans from the South, first of all. And unfortunately, the climate movement has been one that has been ascribed to, the white middle class experience. And so much of the ways that the narrative has been put out there is it's very apocalyptic. It's, the Rachel Carson, no shade to Rachel Carson, but Rachel Carson, I love Rachel Carson, Silent Spring was a great book that jump-started the mainstream environmental movement, but there's reasons why the environmental justice movement really emerged a decade later. Because grassroots organizers, Black people who were leading the civil rights movement were going, hey, okay, clearly the environment is an issue, but how come y'all aren't talking about the distributive justice of it all? Why are you prioritizing elite advocacy on Capitol Hill, for example, and not the type of advocacy that's happening on the ground in our communities? Why are you not talking about how our race and gender and our socioeconomic status inform the ways in which we experience the environment? And how come you're only seeing environmental issues as those that are quote-unquote woods and water, but not those that are happening in our communities, that are happening in our backyard, that are happening in our bodies? And so the environmental justice movement, in a lot of ways, is a corrective movement that is really from a Black feminist praxis that says that we need to focus on redistributive justice. And we need to center on the lived experience and expertise of the folks who know the issues the best. And with Black Girl Environmentalist, when I came up with the organization with some of my friends, one of the things that we wanted to do was to ensure that the North Star of the organization was grounded in Black feminism. And so we specifically identified this theory, this framework called Black Women's Best. It was coined by Gerald Jones, who at the time was the chief economist at the Department of Labor. Unfortunately, that term is no longer on the website, but it was there. And it asserts that when you bring Black women from the margins, from economic precarity into economic prosperity, the rest of us benefit. And we understand that Black youth, young Black girls, young Black gender expansive folks need to see themselves in this work to get their foot in the door, but then also to stay, because ultimately we are not going to build a just climate future that reimagines our world from a carceral framework, that reimagines our world where we can all not just survive but thrive unless we are at the forefront of decision making And so we are just one part of that puzzle. There are so many organizations that do similar work, but we're specifically trying to create better pipelines and also focus on retention as a strategy to keep our movement as one that is for us, by us.
Thank you. So Alicia, I'm going to circle back to you for a second because, you know, Black feminists have created some of the most definitive hashtags of our lifetime. Of course, there's Black Lives Matter, Tarana Burke's Me Too, Kimberly Crenshaw and the African American Policy Institute Say Her Name. And yet you've been known to warn us that hashtags don't start movements. So where did that warning come from? Let's get into it.
Y'all know how this goes. Y'all know how this goes. I mean, there's a way in which, in this country, there's a lot of folks who are trying to look into what we're up to, and they want to know how we do it, right? And so for a while, after BLM started, people wanted to know, how do I do that? But they were asking the question in the form of, well, what hashtag can we start? As if this movement wasn't people in motion, not just online, but like for real in community. And as if people were not already networked and growing their networks, right? As if there was not like a vibe going on. And you could just put a hashtag in front of something and things will explode. That's not how it happens. And that's not how movements happen. Hashtags are ways for people to follow the conversation, but they are not of themselves the conversation. I think also at that time, one of the things that started to happen was that because, I mean, it's so weird, right? Like in my lifetime, there has not been a moment where activism was like popular or celebritized.
Yeah.
And so people were wanting to know, right, well, how do I become an influencer? Not how can I become an organizer? How can I be an influencer? And so what I was trying to do with like that intervention around hashtags don't start movements, people do, is to like really ground us in where our power comes from, right? We have a lot of power. There's a lot of power that we share, right, on platforms that don't belong to us. But there's also like, I want us to have the power of story in terms of how it is that we have not just survived, but been resilient through all kinds of things, including many phases of fascism in this country. This ain't the first. Right, y'all know that.
Yes.
So, and I also was trying to just intervene for us around what does it take to build power and make change. There's a way in which, in this country, the way we talk about how change is made is like a superhero model that I think demobilizes people, and it makes people feel like they are not agents of change themselves. That they too cannot do incredible things just as one person or as a group of people in a small place. Like everybody has the capacity to make change. But what we can do with these stories, right, like the way we talk about Rosa Parks, or the way we talk about King, or the way we talk about even us, right, is we imbue people with like supernatural powers, as opposed to letting the story of how human beings change, grow, evolve, come into consciousness, and then do something with that. The story of how this nation was built, but also the story of how we have thrived and survived. And so I wanted to just reground us in that, because if we keep doing those, people fell from the sky and they had all these skills and they had all these talents, they just knew how to move people, then you won't think that you can do that because you already here, right? And then the last thing I'll say on that piece, Akiba, is I wanted to make sure that instead of people wanting to start hashtags, that people would want to get involved in movements that could change our lives, right? Please don't start another hashtag. right? We need more people to start organizations. We need more people to build political homes for people who feel like there's nobody listening to them and nobody cares about the things that they care about. That's why this is so special. We need more of that. So that's why I be popping off at the mouth talking about hashtags don't start movements.
That's actually in her official bio, by the way, so in case you didn't know, now you know. So, Beulah, I want to have you talk about being a girls' basketball coach in West Philadelphia, because that really struck me when we talked. And you talked about how just your interactions help shape your political action. So talk to me about like the mechanism through which, as a high school basketball coach, that led to political action or political consciousness.
Yes. Are there any former athletes here? Can you raise your hand? Okay. I just wanted to. Okay. So y'all don't know what I'm talking about, and if you're not a former athlete, you still know what I'm talking about. So I will say that basketball changed my life. My father passed away when I was very young. And a couple of years later, I got introduced to an AAU coach that became a father figure. And I didn't know I was grieving at the time because I was a child, but I also got introduced to a new set of sisters that comforted me when I could have gone a very different route. I was able to play basketball in college, so I had a free education, didn't have to burden my mom. And so I've always seen basketball as a safety net and a vehicle, but I also know that it taught me about competitive nature in a very unhealthy way. Sports can be utilized to be very individualistic. Sports can operate from a scarcity mindset, right? Because it's like, you know, hungry dogs run faster, go get it, you're him, and then kill yourself. Like that's kind of what we're taught as athletes. I'm like joking, but I'm not very serious, especially if you play at the collegiate level. So when I was in graduate school, I wanted to pay it forward, and I wanted to help coach young Black girls and do so from a place of love and caring about them in ways that I didn't really get, because I never had a Black female coach in 20-something years of like playing sports. And so I came in thinking I had all the answers. I was like, I'm going to teach these kids discipline. I'm going to, teach them you need to get A's and B's in order to play and all that. And they humbled and taught me so much. And they grounded me, right? So around the same time that I was starting to coach, I also started working at New Voices as a communications manager. And I tell people all the time that when I was learning about theory and analysis and reproductive justice, when I was reading in text, my kids were teaching me in action. And so as I was working a 9 to 5 and then having a break and then going to practice and then coming back and finishing work that I had abandoned so I could finish the practice, my kids are coming to me with the byproducts of housing insecurity, of repressed sexual trauma. I thought that my kids initially, when I started coaching them, I thought they had bad attitudes. And I was like, I gotta break these kids. I gotta show them tough love, right? Reproductive justice taught me that that is not fair to these young girls. It taught me that their white counterparts get to be children. And I'm trying to hasten their maturation to save them, but I'm pushing them towards accepting something that is going to harm them in the long run, right? I had a player that was murdered in 2016 in the Pulse Club shooting in Orlando. Her name was Akiba Murray. And when she was murdered, I was depressed. I fell apart. And what made me get back together was I had 20 young girls that just lost a teammate themselves. And so I hit up one of my former professors who taught Greek, and I asked her if she could do 2 sessions for my players. And she said, yes, of course. And during our first session, I had a 15-year-old player who looked at me and said, Coach B, I'm sorry, I'm numb. And I said, don't be sorry, why are you numb? And she said, I have lost 10 people in the last 3 months. This is nothing to me. And it broke me, right? And so from there, I realized that I was pushing my kids towards excellence. And I was pushing them because I wanted basketball and sports to be a vehicle for them to better their lives beyond their time with me. But that moment taught me I had the opportunity to do it right then and there. And from there, instead of prioritizing winning, instead of prioritizing structure and discipline, I learned that I was an organizer, engaging young people on a daily basis, and I could have conversations with them about what they deserve versus what they're getting. So that is how coaching really radicalized me. The league we were in was also white as hell. It was racist as hell. And because y'all are and okay, let me add something else. The league that we were in is called the Philadelphia Catholic League. You would assume it's predominantly black because it's the Philadelphia Catholic League. Well, it wasn't. Of 13 teams in schools, only 6 of us actually lived in Philly proper. So 7 were out in the suburbs, right? And so it was a very white league. Most of the years that I was coaching, I was the only black female coach. The other times I was accompanied by another black woman and a black man. But I could just see the difference. I could see my kids' faces when we didn't have the matching apparel. We didn't have the golf tournaments, the paper trips across the country to California. So it also taught me tenacity. The disparity with the resources that my kids had versus the kids in the suburbs pissed me off. We didn't have a nurse every day. Like, we didn't have a library. So I had to learn how to fundraise. I had to learn how to design t-shirts, and we sold the t-shirts. But the community leaned in. When we started getting good, people were like, okay, I'm gonna rock with y'all. So of our very white league in 2020, when my team won our league championship, I actually was the, thank you. But with winning that championship, I was the first black coach on the boys or girls side to win the championship. The league's been around for 105 years, actually 107 now, right? The Philadelphia Catholic League. The next year, we won the state championship, and I was the first black woman in all of Pennsylvania to win it. Now, I don't say that because I'm such a great coach. I say that because RJ taught me how to treat my players. Okay? RJ taught me, don't beat these kids up because they're not talking and walking and thinking and speaking the way that you want them to. Help them see what they deserve and help them see the barriers in between where they're at and what they deserve. So that's how coaching really radicalized me and how RJ informed how I show up as a leader now.
Amazing, thank you. Thank you. So, Wawa, you mentioned a minute ago Rachel Carson and that being, what's the book called again? I can't remember.
Silent Spring.
Silent, yeah. So, you know, I've heard Rachel Carson as the origin story of environmentalism, right? And so my question for you is, what's your origin story for the work that you do?
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting because I have 2 things to say about that. Rachel Carson is not the origin story of environmentalism or stewardship, period. Even though there are textbooks that might contend to that. You know, it's Black and Indigenous matriarchs who are the original stewards of our planet. And so much of that story is what has led me to being a, you could say, next gen steward myself. So my family's from Kenya, and growing up I had, you could say, a bit of a sanitized story of how my parents came to the US. I won't bore you with that story, but it was interesting because I took an environmental science class in high school, and one of our assignments was to discover our climate stories. It was asserting that climate change isn't just this issue that's far off, impacting, you know, the Arctic and the polar bears, but it's also a very deeply personal experience, and it is in and of itself a story of heartbreak and loss that has already happened. But it's also a story that has already impacted all of our lives, even if we haven't yet had the language to articulate that. And so it led into a long conversation with my parents where I discovered that one of the big reasons why they had left their homeland was because of drought. So the Horn of Africa has been experiencing a more than 40-year-long drought, which is actually tied to colonization, which we could have a longer conversation about how the origin story of the climate crisis is imperialism, colonialism, white supremacy, etc. But for them, farming was a way of life that they could very well see might not be a reality for the rest of their lives. So for them, being able to raise a family meant going somewhere else. And so there's more to that story, but I began to understand that the climate crisis had already impacted my life in the US. I'm in Horn of Africa, leading my family to come to the US. But I also realized that my understanding of the American dream was actually impacted by the climate crisis, because you have so many people who immigrate to this country thinking that there are going to be opportunities just to be poisoned by the water, air, and the communities that they're moving to, alongside other Black and brown people who have had to live in these conditions for decades. And so I think that it's important to contextualize that. But also I want to respond to something that you said earlier around the political circumstances that we're in right now aren't new. And this is something that really frustrates me about the climate community. I feel like I spend a lot of time, coming at the climate space, but it's out of love. But that's because, again, I talked earlier about how the narrative has been very apocalyptic, starting like in the 70s, 80s, 90s, where folks are like, we have 5, 10, 20 years left. And it doesn't really resonate with the reality that the end of times has already come for so many of us. I'm a student of Black geographers, and it was so interesting when I came across this term called the Black Anthropocenes. So we know, Black Anthropocenes, yes. So Black Anthropocenes asserts that for Black and Indigenous people, the end of time, because of colonization, because of imperialism, because of white supremacy, has already happened for us. So the climate crisis is not our first existential threat. It is the biggest one that any of us have had to deal with, but it's not our first. We have gone through so many things before, and that lens is one that needs to be better understood in the climate movement, because why wouldn't you have people that already know what it looks like to build a tomorrow that has never been guaranteed? Why wouldn't those folks be the ones leading our movements? It doesn't make any sense.
Happened, I guess 2 weeks ago. I don't know if anybody saw the Breakfast Club interview with Benet, where Just Hilarious, who I don't find particularly funny, said, "Thank God you're here, so now you can say women are the only ones that have babies." And Benet answered, I hope to be able to share the clip, but essentially what she did was very calmly and matter-of-factly was like, if you have a uterus, you can bear a child. And that was striking to me because there have been moments that I've observed just through movement where people respond to that kind of ignorance with a lot of verbiage. And I think sometimes it has gotten lost. And so Beulah, another thing that we talked about was code switching within our own. So can you talk about that process? Like, how do you, when you're on the Breakfast Club and one of the hosts tries to enlist you in something that you know is absolute fuckery, sorry for language, but when you see that, code switching is important. So talk about that ability to have facility with language.
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever be on the Breakfast Club, so I think that was
You won't be on the Breakfast Club.
But yeah, I definitely saw that clip, and yes. I believe that effective organizers, strategists, scholars are translators. And I feel like in order to translate, you have to understand one world, and you have to understand the world that you're trying to communicate to. And so when Akiba and I had a conversation about this discussion, I talked about how a lot of, like I said earlier, a lot of the words that we use, they are big words. It can be intimidating. And a lot of the conversations I've been hearing in the workshops are about like a practice, right? So that's why I say that it's important, and Alicia was talking about this, it's important to show how people have arrived at the analysis that they have, because otherwise, not only are people presented as superheroes, but they're presented as celebrity. And oftentimes we recognize people's highlight reels, but not the behind the scenes. And that is a disservice to our people, because it seems as if this is not a process, right? We're undermining the daily unlearning, the daily checking of ego, right? We have to learn how to abandon what feels comfortable and safe, because it is killing us, right? We are taught to be complicit in the engineering of our death. We're taught to punch down, and that is not saving anybody. So when I think about effective organizers, scholars, they're people that understand where people are coming from, understand what their concerns are, understand what their hopes are, and don't look down on them. Don't say, you just don't get it. Fred Hampton used to talk about all the time, we cannot look down on our people, right? We have to understand our people. We have to understand their plight. So when I talk about code switching, I was saying that you don't say the same thing to your parent that you would say to a lover, that you would say to a friend, right? That you would say to a coworker. You might have the same message, but you know how to customize that message for your particular audience. And sometimes I think some of us, it's so big, we want people to get it. We want them to get it immediately because we care for them. But it comes across in a dismissive nature, right? Because we act like people already have to be packaged, understand the words we're using, have read the text, right? And again, I want to make sure people understand I'm not talking about dumbing it down. Because there's people that have inherent wisdom that some of us will never understand. So it's important for us to recognize the necessity of effective and collective collaboration and honoring of each other's experiences in ways that doesn't act like our way is the only way, or because people are not communicating or understanding the situation the same way that we are, that they're not worthy of working alongside in our collective collaboration. So that's just the way that I phrased it. Like, it can kind of seem big, it can kind of seem intimidating, but in the same way that you code switch with your everyday people, that's how we should see ourselves as carriers of the kind of conversations that we hold in spaces like this.
Thank you. So I want to talk a bit, just get into pop culture for a second here. And I have a particular interest in body image. I co-edited a book about Black women and body image in the before times, so before social media, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing that I've seen is that Black women, Black femmes, Black gender expansive people are more visible than ever in terms of how, like, actually being able to access images of ourselves. But I've also noticed that some people seem to believe that representation alone is enough. So it begins with representation matters, and it ends with representation matters. My question is, where does representation fit in with your practice? Why is it important? And we got to that a little bit earlier, Wawa, with the visual representation. But I guess we're just sort of at a crossroad where we are the pulse, right? We are all the vibe, and at the same time, we look at our political strength and our financial strength, and it doesn't have the same representation. So I'm curious about how do we represent, and then how do we parlay that into actually building power? Anybody? Let me drill down a little more. Okay. But I think that there's quite a bit of discussion too about influencers. And the idea that if you have a large following, that means that you will be able to do ... And so I feel like everybody on the stage in some way is an influencer. So talk about that part of it. Like, how do you parlay being an influencer? How do you react to even that sort of designation?
I'm probably like the most Luddite person in terms of a social media thing, but you're right, there's like a way in which some of us have platforms. And so I think the question is really like, what is the best way to use those platforms? And I pose a question to us often that is about receipts and range. Receipts and range. So let me get into it for a second. So on the question of representation and like what gets you there and like what are the tools? I mean, years and years and years and years and years and years and years of movement building. and organizing and building relationships and being in this work. And that's important to me because those are receipts for me, right? Like I don't just like talk about stuff. I've done things and I do things and there are things that are important to me and there are things that I think are important to this movement. With this, like the celebrity culture that we've built, like I'm glad that you brought this up, we actually don't ask for receipts or range, but we will repeat things that people say, right? Without asking Ella Baker's question, which is, who are your people? Right? I want to know first, right? Why you think what you think, how you know, and from where. That's what I call receipts. And then range is kind of similar to that, right? I want to hear from people, I want to hear your experience, but I want to know, is this an opinion? Or is this something that you've done? That matters, right? Opinions, we can all have them, and we should all have them. We do all have them. Experience also should matter. And I do think that that's contested. It has been contested. And it's a conversation that we should have amongst us, right? In a really honest and robust way. An opinion is not the same as experience. But experience doesn't mean that you can't continue to learn and have new experiences. But we should just be rigorous about that, right? So range and receipts. And when I talk about like people that have platforms and what you use them for, that is also about range and receipts, right? I'm actually totally an introvert, and I'm so glad that when you were talking earlier, I don't like doing this stuff, and I'm often like a 2 to 3 person, not a 10, 15, 20 people person. I don't use platforms because I like to hear my voice, although I do think it's kind of sexy sometimes. But I use platforms to advance a political agenda, right? A podcast is my way of helping us digest really shitty information and figure out what we do about it, not because I wanted to be an influencer, right? We started that podcast in 2020 and the goal was, let me help you break through the news cycle. I know you don't want to watch the news and you stuck inside, so let me help you break that down. And then we're going to sprinkle it with some pop culture because that's how I understand politics and I think it's a lot of how we do. And then we're going to also have political conversations and get behind the scenes with people that you might know of for something, but you don't know them as people, and that's important too. Range, receipts. I think sometimes with the representation question, we haven't totally always discerned. Are you using this platform because of your ego? Or are you using it to move a political agenda? And it's no bad, but it's helpful to know what's what, because when you need to do something, right, and people are calling themselves influencers, organizers, strategists, all the things, political strategists, well, when you really need that, you want to know what ground you're standing on, right? So that's why. And then the last thing I'll say on this piece is, for me, I want us to have more full-throated conversations on the representation front about, is my opinion important because I'm Black? Or because I'm a woman? Or because I'm, right? Or is there something more nuanced that we can add to that conversation? So it's the opposite of the conversation that Bernie Sanders and them are having right now about identity politics. I don't like that conversation. Y'all know that conversation? Okay, it's the opposite of that. But there's something that we can do, I think, to keep adding levels and layers to. What does that mean? Why is it important to be a Black feminist? It's not just being a Black feminist is important, why? What does that add to the world? What does that add to the conversation? Like you did with your story about coaching, how does my lens about reproductive justice help me navigate the world, humans, organizing, connections, relationships I want us to do more full-throatedness of that, because I think it helps us clarify what our base of power is in an authoritarian moment, that we can then communicate to one another in different ways. Does that make sense?
Makes all the sense,
All right.
thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, well, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just offer, so Ruha Benjamin, who's an Afrofuturist who I really enjoy, she had a quote, she said, "Black faces in high places will not save us," right? And I think we see this also when we act like Black excellence will save us, right? As if Black excellence isn't riddled with classism and elitism, right? As if Black excellence doesn't cut out fat people who don't look the part. As if Black excellence doesn't dismiss disabled folks, right? So no identity is inherently bad, right? And I just want to share that, because I get frustrated when people think if you assert a Black person in a position, hands clean, it's all taken care of. It's so frustrating. So I just want to offer what Ruha Benjamin said about Black places and high places not saving us, because we're still embedding ourselves within systems that are killing people within the U.S. context and abroad. So,
Thank you. There it is. So, I actually want to hear a bit more about each of you. Who's your North Star in terms of Black feminisms? Who do you look to? Whose work do you look to? And maybe someone from a generation ago, or the generation before yours, and then the generation that you're in now.
It's interesting. I feel like I almost feel a little set up with a question.
No, it's not a setup.
Because you're like, okay, let's not deify people, but there's some people that are like, okay, I'll TV about there, like, come on. I say that because the first thing I read at the beginning of this year was Earthseed, and it, lack of a better word, fucked me up. I just started my Saturn return 2 weeks ago. Anyone else? Yes, I'm praying for all of you. And we were talking about astrology earlier, and those Saturnian vibes have been in motion for the past couple of months, but something that I've personally been struggling a lot with is change. And Earthseed, reminds us all that the only constant in life is change, that God has changed, and all we can do is surrender to her. And for that, I will say Akiba above there. As far as someone today, to be honest, there's so many Black women climate organizers and activists who are the North Star of the EJ movement, and unfortunately do not get enough shine. Kind of lending itself to your last question, I'll speak from an environmental climate movement perspective. There certainly was the influencification of environmental justice post-2020, and there's a long conversation there around new terms like intersectional environmentalism, which is a vehicle for what environmental justice has always been. But what I'll say is that for some of the matriarchs of the movement, Dr. Beverly Wright, who is from this state, folks like Miss Sharon Levine, who is from New Orleans, Dr. Joe and Joy Banner from the Descendants Project, they buy back plantations in this state to fight back against the petrochemical industry, but then also to fight back against the narrative violence of plantations. And I think it's important for us to turn to women like that in the environmental movement who may not have the numbers when it comes to a social media page, but who certainly are doing the work every single day.
So when I think of individual North Stars, I think of people like June Jordan and Joy James. Those are the kind of people that resonate with me. But I also think about how so much of our work is the collective and leaning into community. So I think about my team. My team humbles me, they inspire me.
Say their names.
Tasha, Jada, Ayana, Alicia, you know, I think about people like Cherie Scott, who is sister of Richard Memphis. I think about Jan Flynn, who just stood up, like, you better recognize me, you better call that. But I oftentimes talk about my origin into the movement because I really feel like I stumbled into this. Like, I'm not gonna hold y'all, during my interview process, I thought this was a scam. Because I was like, every person I'm talking to is a black woman? What is this? And I realized that there was a whole movement waiting for me. And I had no idea. And so it drives me. Like, some of y'all who I've ever had a one-to-one conversation with, you're like, damn, Beulah, you're intense. Yeah, I'm a Scorpio. But I also so eagerly want my people to get this. I want my people to come into it, but I also want the movement to be welcoming of my people. So I think about how a lot of people have poured into me without me asking, and how I want to offer that to other people. So I really think about the collective nature of the work that we do, and how many of us are a culmination of the best people and best communities that have poured into us, and how I want to continue that legacy.
Whew, so many. I think I saw Kai in the building. Did I see Kai? Hi, Kai. You're one of my North Stars. For real. Also Linda Burnham, who helped start the Third World Women's Alliance. Her mom, Dorothy Burnham, who turned 110 this year. And she's still doing yoga and collaging and eating ice cream. And why they're my North Stars, honestly, I think, Kai has just been trying to get us on track for so long. And loving us deeply along the way, and sometimes popping us upside the head, which was also necessary. Linda, for reminding us that this is a country of 360 million people, and so we need to get serious about power. And Dorothy, at 110, what haven't you lived through? You know, and the fact that you can still be smiling and deeply joyful and creating inspires me. I feel like, what's wrong with me? What am I doing? What am I complaining about, actually? And then contemporarily, I'm shouting out Paris. Honestly, Paris, you are a vibe. You are a whole entire vibe. One of the things that I think you do to shape Black feminism, Paris, is you make it ours, in the wholest, most joyful way. You bring so much energy to this movement, and so much yes, we can, and we are, and we do to this. And there was a time, my dear, where that just was not true. You know? And so I just really want to appreciate your conjuring. The way you conjure is something really special. So, thank you.
So I'm going to switch to some questions here. The first one, what do you say to those of us who believe terms like feminism and liberal are exclusionary, inherently evil? How would you get them to open up to listening to the truth? Sure. What do you say to those of us who believe terms like feminism and liberal are exclusionary or inherently evil? How would you get them to open up to listening to the truth? It's kind of a doozy. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Maybe let's start with feminism, right? So there was a moment, I can say there was a moment, I used to work in hip hop media, and one of the worst insults that somebody gave me was that they called me a feminist, but they meant it in a bad way. And automatically associated feminism with whiteness and white women, ... And that was a really difficult place to be in at that point. And I had to do a lot of educating one-on-one. So have you all had to do any of that kind of education? And if so, how did you do it? Do you remember what you said?
I mean, yeah. I think we've all had this, well, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think this is a familiar conversation. The way I heard the question was like, how do you deal with somebody who feels that way? But if I heard the question wrong, let me know. Can I just be honest? Like, I like to have real fights. Sometimes I think some of these things are not like real fights, you know? So, and some of these arguments are not arguments you're gonna win with someone who's like really committed to being and feeling that way. I will say that what feels important in a conversation that you choose to have with someone is listening to understand if this is actually a conversation that can go somewhere, or if you're just assessing, right, what the landscape is. And I encourage us to struggle with people, and I also don't want us like sitting inside of magical thinking that like, you know, sometimes those conversations are red herrings that will take you a place that you probably don't even really need to go. So that's one thing I would offer. The second thing I would offer is I would ask, how do you understand feminism? Right? Because sometimes people have a lot of judgments or misperceptions or stereotypes, or like it's a big scary thing, right? And then third, there is a question in that conversation that is about our humanity and our dignity, and do you believe that I deserve it? Because that's how I understand feminism. Feminism is about my dignity, it's about my humanity, and it's my right to self-determine. So if you're good with that, then you're actually good with feminism, right? And you can call it whatever you want, I don't care what you call it. But I also don't want to, I pray that with all the folk that are genuinely interested, that don't get to have conversations with us, that we don't spend a ton of time with folks who are committed to misunderstanding you. So just understanding the difference here.
And I would add, this question makes me think about, like when somebody shares a joke and the punchline is like colorism or misogyny, or like, I'm like, somebody asks them, can you explain the joke? And their face cracks. Because you're like supposed to laugh at the joke being on you or people that you care about. And so it makes me think about like what you said, like how do you define like these words? Like what does this mean? Because my attachment is not to a word, right? It's to people understanding what I'm about, what I want for myself, what I want for them, and getting to the root of it. I do not think that agreement and alignment are the same thing, right? And so it's like better understanding what is at the root of this belief that whatever word is evil, what's at the root of it? Because I think when you have a relationship, it can go an inch or two deeper beyond something that kind of stings you. This is why I talk about the practice of being an organizer, strategist. I do think that we have to develop the muscle for these kind of thoughts, especially if we're talking about bringing people to the movement, to not be a thing that has us dismiss people. Especially when we're talking about things like abolition. Like to me, that's meaning like not disposing of people, not dismissing of people. So there's also an opportunity for us to put that into practice as we're also showing people what beloved community looks like within our current oppressive system. So I just want to offer that because I have one foot in the RJ world and one foot in the sports world. And the stuff I hear in the sports world is wild. But I also hear a lot of frustration. I hear Black male coaches that are like, damn Coach B, like, you know, people don't see all the work that we do. They don't see the rides that we give. They don't see the food that we buy kids. But in my head, I'm like, but y'all be making like wild ass jokes, right? And so that's an opportunity to kind of like interrogate and disrupt, but we have relationships. So also, whoever asked that question, I also want to offer the importance of relationship, right? To not present yourself as an instructor, but rather to invite somebody into an understanding and be open and comfortable, better understanding where they're at as well. And the last thing I'll offer is, many people here have probably persuaded somebody, right? Right, when you're kids, want some money or whatever. So it's like, that's how I see this too. Like, it's the art of persuasion. It's the art of understanding what somebody's self-interest is. One of my first organizing one-on-one trainings taught me about the importance of self-interest. And I've had to do the work for it to not be manipulative or extractive in the way that I was taught, right? But to really want to invest myself into someone's present, understand past afflictions and worldviews that harm them, and help them recognize that whatever you desire to be in the future, I want to be there with you too. So then to your point, things like words and labels really feel very shallow or surface level when you're able to establish that bond with people.
Did you want to? Okay. So the next question, how is the manosphere and disinformation impacting the work you do, especially how people understand information and what is real and what is factual? The manosphere, yeah, so the manosphere is like Joe Rogan, but also Joe Budden. the Joes, Charlemagne the God, you know, men's rights, quote unquote, that's it. Kevin, yes, the R.I. something, Kevin Samuels. Yes, R.I. something, R.I. But yeah, so disinformation, and I think what I'm gonna do a bit of interpretation with this question. I would say disinformation through the lens of misogyny. So, you know, these ideas. So how is this affecting your work? And if so, how are you coping with that?
That type of ideology is running our country right now, so I feel like it's impacting us all. You know, I'll speak as someone who's, I'm sure everyone up here and everyone out here who's doing any type of work around protecting our collective well-being is dealing with the ramifications around funding, for example. There was a time 8 months ago, for example, we're in a grant application for a federal grant. There were millions of dollars that the EPA, for example, put out for environmental justice, for communities to finally have the financial capital necessary to scale climate initiatives, which have been pulled back by the Trump administration. Where there was a time where we could, in a grant application, break down the ways in which women, for example, experience the climate crisis first and worst, and how if you go deeper, it is low-income Black and Indigenous women who are experiencing the brunt of these issues and why blah, blah, blah. Now you can be penalized and even criminalized for submitting that in application. So it is having tangible impacts in our ability to live out loud with the work that we do. But strategically, on the other hand, I will say in my perspective, it's leading to a lot of radical collaboration. There's a lot of environmental justice organizations who have lost upwards of 90% of their funding in the past 6 months. Organizations that are dedicated to safeguarding our collective rights, our access to clean air, clean water, our ability to self-determine what a safe and healthy community is. And what that looks like underground is a lot of folks having to ask the question, what does it look like for organizations to combine? What does it look like for us to pool our resources? What does it look like for a small organization that doesn't have capacity for general counsel to be able to safeguard themselves against, the right-wing losers who are creating organizations to, specifically target organizations that serve Black feminists, that serve whoever it might be that's not, a white guy. There are these networks that existed but are really becoming more solid in this moment around what does it look like for us to survive this moment, and how do we continue to do this work when there are these overlying, actors who are deeply committed to disrupting the work that we need to do. And so I go back when you're talking about, the grandmother you're talking about who's been around for a long time. These are moments where we're really leaning on movements of the past of how to navigate, again, what radical collaboration looks like.
It's a lot. So, the manosphere and disinfo and misinfo is like one of the main translators now of Black Lives Matter, right? And so it is now described as a feminist agenda to hijack the Black family, the nuclear family, and then there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. And what it means is that because of the character and nature of the manosphere, like it actually encourages violence, right? I can't tell you how many rape threats, death threats, all kinds of threats that we get literally for trying to be free, right? There's lots of it in there, and it is anti-queer, it is anti-woman, it is anti-everything, and it stands on a narrative thread in the manosphere about, it's like this thread that is very dismissive and threatened by women's leadership, and very suspicious of women's leadership and its goals, its aims, and it also kind of names it as not good enough, right, to reinvigorate the Black nation. So these are things that then get passed around to podcasts and, all the different things, but they just, I'm saying this to say it has real tangible consequences, so much so that if you talk to kids, like between 9 and 12, because they're getting all their stuff off of YouTube, they will repeat those same things. When they hear Black Lives Matter, they'll be like, oh, isn't that the, right? So it is important for us to figure out, number one, how to have these conversations, and the piece that you're talking about in terms of code switching. But then there's also a piece in here about how do we reclaim narratives about our own stuff, right? Even in the midst of trying to figure out what our next phase is. Like how do we reclaim our own stories about what our movements are about? And how do we get into a strong conversation about what misinformation and disinformation is feeding in people, like the human part of it, right? Like, what is that fear? What is that anxiety? What is that being left out or left behind? And how can we, right, rather than trying to convince people not to think a thing, how can we help meet needs, right, that come around the other way of countering some of those conversations.
Does anybody want to add anything? Because I think we are. So I think we're at our time, but just lightning round real quick, because I always love to do this. What's bringing you delight right now? It doesn't have to be, it could be.
Weightlifting and doji.
Hey.
My cats.
I would say rest, I love when I get to sleep. I thought you were gonna do like can I offer one thing? Like, I just wanna offer this because again, I've been talking about narrative and all that. And it's especially with the last question that you asked, it says, people see leaves and branches and mistake them for roots. You're upside down, right? People see leaves and branches and mistake them for roots. You're upside down. And it just makes me think about how like a lot of people operate like in fear, and so it causes them to say certain things. I see misogyny, the disciplining of women and people outside, non-men that would operate a certain way. But outside of that, I would say rest. I watch this thing called the beef sector, where people like argue with each other, and it just gives me life. So I'm sorry, I just admitted that to like hundreds of people, whatever. But that's what gives me life these days.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This is bringing collective joy, so thank you so much, Black Feminist Future. Thank you to Wawa, Alicia, and Beulah. We appreciate you. Take good care. More time. Thank you. Some real knowledge, some real power. I definitely hope that you're walking away from this session with that good spirit that you need, that good wisdom to go forth and be a part of our community in the best capacity that you can. We want to wish you well in this movement. With that, I will have just a couple of announcements. We do currently have a break that you have, and then after the break around 8 p.m. is turn up time. So we want to invite you to come back out, have fun with us, get to know more people if you haven't met folks already. And if you are not currently a member of BFF, we want to invite you in. We would love to have you be a part of these conversations, these practices, the things that you've been hearing just in today, year-round, is what becomes really important. And we are a place that would happily bring you into this home. So check us out, join the movement, contribute towards the movement, and we want to wish you so well. We will see you this evening. Thanks, y'all.